Good morning. It sure is good to be with every one of you here this morning, and it's a great honor to stand in this stage and before you where so many great men have proclaimed the gospel through the years. So it's an honor to be with you. This morning is not going to be one of those topics that's like really uplifting and cheerful, but it's something that we really need to talk about. Antonio Cooper Jr. was just 6 months old whenever his life was taken in the Oklahoma City bombing in April of 1995. He was in a daycare in the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building whenever the terrorists decided to plant a bomb in front of that building. So his life was taken along with about 167 others. Here we have Christine Lee Hansen. She was just 2 years old when she was on Flight United 175 when it was intentionally flown into the World Trade Center, September 11th, 2001. Her life and almost 3,000 others were taken that day. August 2005, Hurricane Katrina swept through. About 1,400 people lost their lives from the aftermath of that storm. May 2011, Joplin tornado came through, destroyed thousands of homes, took about 160 lives. People were displaced. People lost their homes. There's about 300,000 children who pass away from cancer each year. There's death, disease, all kinds of tragedy around us. Now, we don't have to spend a lot of time pointing this out. All you got to do is just turn on the news, and we see awful things happening all of the time. And it makes people question, why does God allow this to happen? And the question that often comes is this: if God is so loving, why is there so much pain? And so the thought process is this. So we are taught and we teach others that God is all loving, He is all powerful, and He is all knowing. If that's the case, why is there so much tragedy? Why is there so much evil? Why is there so much pain and suffering? We can see it in the world around us and in our own lives, terrible things that are happening. But if God is so loving, why is this happening? And so they start questioning, and we might even start questioning like, well, if God is all loving, why does He allow this to happen? Does He just not care? Well, if God is supposed to be all knowing, does He not know what's happening? Is He not aware of all the tragedy? If God is all powerful, is He not able to stop it? And so these questions start coming up in our minds. And a lot of people who don't want to believe in God will use this as their basis to say there cannot be a God. There cannot be a God who is loving and powerful and knowing and still allow all of this tragedy to occur. Now, this lesson isn't something that's probably new for most of you, but this is something that I think that we need to discuss periodically because this is a big deal. A lot of people that I've dealt with in my life and out in the world, they'll say that there can't be a God because of all the evil, pain, and suffering that's going on. He can't be all loving and allow this to happen. He can't be all knowing and all powerful, or He'd put a stop to it. And when tragedy occurs in our lives, if we're not careful, we can start to go down that path too. Well, why is this happening to me? Why is God allowing this to happen? And so we need to make sure that we have a basis in our own lives and an understanding of why this is occurring so that our faith doesn't waver, and that we can then spread the gospel to others. We can answer those questions. Does God not care? Does He not know? Is He unable to stop it? If God's so loving, why is there so much pain? Well, first we've got to realize that we are what we call free moral agents. And what that means is we do have the ability to choose. God didn't make us robots to just serve Him as slaves with the inability to make choices. So that term free moral agents means that each and every one of us has the ability to make choices in our lives. The Bible does say that God is love. 1 John 4:8, it says that God is love. So that is a fact. God is all loving. He demonstrates that, like Romans 5 and verse 8 says that God demonstrates His love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So God is love. And part of that love is He gave us this ability to choose and to make choices in our lives. We see that through Scriptures. For example, Joshua told the Israelites in Joshua 24:15, "If it's disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which are beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Joshua said, choose who you're going to serve. Similarly, in 1 Kings 18:21, when Elijah was before the prophets of Baal, it says that Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." So Elijah's saying, like, just make a choice already. So as human beings, we have the ability to choose. Although we make our own choices, there are rules that we must obey. There's cause and effect in everyday life. If all choices had the same results, how could we possibly learn right from wrong? So we've got to establish that fact to understand why there's evil, pain, and suffering in the world. It's because we have that ability to choose, and as a result, sometimes we suffer and we have pain in our lives because of our own personal wrong choices. And since we are free moral agents, that means we don't always choose correctly. An example of that we can be found in Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6. Beginning in verse 2, we read here, "The power of Midian prevailed against Israel. Because of Midian, the sons of Israel made for themselves the dens which were in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds. For it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites would come up with the Amalekites and the sons of the east and go against them. So they would camp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza and leave no sustenance in Israel, as well as no sheep, ox, or donkey. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents, and they would come in like locusts for number. Both they and their camels were innumerable, and they came into the land to devastate it. So Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the sons of Israel cried to the Lord." So what we have going on here is that Israel is suffering because Midian has come in and just devastated them. And they were crying out to God, "God, why is this happening?" Well, we see in verse 10 that God responds and says, "I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not obeyed me." We skip back up to verse 1. We didn't read of Judges 6. "The sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord gave them into the hands of Midian 7 years." Why were these people suffering? Why were the Israelites suffering? They chose not to obey God. They broke the rules, and they were suffering. Sometimes we suffer because of our own personal wrong choices. Sometimes our choices have dire consequences. You know, someone might decide to rob the convenience store and shoot the clerk, and then he's going to be arrested and then sentenced to jail, or maybe even sentenced to die. And then someone might say, well, if there is a God, he could have prevented that whole thing from happening. But not if he wants us to have free moral agency. He wouldn't do that. You know, we live in the freest land of all, but we still have rules and guidelines, and breaking those rules results in consequences. 1 Peter 4:15, Peter says, "Let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters." So sometimes we'll suffer because of our poor choices. Proverbs 13, verse 15 says, "Good understanding produces favor, but the way of transgressors is hard." I saw a meme one time that I think sums up this point pretty well. It said, "Life is hard. It's even harder if you're stupid." So sometimes we suffer because we're stupid. We make some bad choices. We do things that are wrong, and we're going to suffer as a result of that. Now, that seems like a pretty easy one to understand, so we'll not spend much more time on that. But sometimes we suffer because of the personal wrong choices of others. You know, we live with a lot of people, and everybody has the ability to make choices, and not everybody chooses well. And so sometimes we are going to suffer as a direct result of the choices that other people make. Probably the best classic example of that would be a drunk driver. So someone is drinking, they're intoxicated, and they make the choice to get behind the wheel of their car. And as a result, they can't control it. Their ability to think and drive is impaired, and they cross the center line, and they hit somebody head on. And so that other car had a teenager in it who was just on her way to work, and she loses her life. We see that happen all the time. It's a tragedy that occurs quite frequently. Why did that young teenager have to lose her life? It's because somebody else made a choice to drink and drive. And so we see that in our lives all the time, that we'll suffer because of other people's choices. There's maybe just even bad drivers make some bad choices. We see, in the news all the time, school shootings that are happening because somebody made a choice to do wrong. Tragedy exists all around us. And so we ask ourselves, why? Why me? Why did it happen to me? Or why my child? And then we'll scream, that's not fair. And it's not. It isn't fair. It's tragic. What can we do about it? Lock ourselves in the room and ask God to let us keep our ability to choose and to be free moral agents, but take other people who don't seem to be choosing very well, take their ability to choose away from them? Nope, that's not going to happen. God loves everyone. John 3:16 says that God so loved the world, he loves everyone. He gave his only begotten Son that whoever believes in him would perish, or would not perish but have everlasting life. And Peter said in Acts 10:34 that he realized that God is not a respecter of persons. So God's going to give every one of us that same ability to make choices. We could live our lives exactly as God would want us to and follow all of our nation's laws to the letter, be the most upstanding citizens there ever were. We're still going to suffer because of what somebody else decided to do. Just like on September 11th, 2001. People were on their way to work, just doing their everyday normal things. And some terrorists decided to make some terrible, terrible choices and take the lives of thousands. The school shooting that happened in Columbine years ago and Uvalde, Texas, just a few years ago. The Catholic school shooting just months ago. It happens all the time. Why did those children in those schools have to die? It's because somebody else made a really bad choice. Why did those people in the Trade Center have to die? It's because somebody else made a very bad choice. We're always suffering because of other people's choices. Why do we suffer? Because someone else made a bad choice, and as a result, it inflicted harm, whether it was intentional or unintentional. So how can we protect our loved ones, our children, and ourselves? We need to make sure that we live safe in the arms of Jesus so that no matter what happens in this life, we'll spend eternity in heaven. Revelation 2, verse 10, John says, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life." James reminds us in James 4 and verse 14, you don't know what your life is going to be like tomorrow. You're just like a vapor that appears for a little while and vanishes away. We need to be ready and prepared for eternity. So we'll suffer because of sometimes our own choices and because of the choices that other people make, but also because of the personal wrong choices of generations past. We've got many blessings today from achievements of our ancestors. I'm very thankful for air conditioning and heating and electricity. We can meet here comfortably this morning, and all the conveniences of life that we have today because of our ancestors have done so many advances in technology and things like that. But you know what? We've also got some curses today because of our ancestors. We can make choices today that will affect generations not even born yet. Here's an example. Sometimes there would be that commercial on TV, and it showed the starving children in Ethiopia, and they're asking for money to help support those kids. And the atheist will take that and rub that in the face of God and say, where is God? Why are those children suffering? They're innocent. They didn't have anything to do with that. Well, why are those children suffering? Well, the old law that God had given to the Israelites long ago instructed them to let their land rest, lie fallow every 7 years, because God knew that you over-farm the land, it's going to essentially kill it. Well, the Ethiopian ancestors ignored that, and they just farmed it and farmed it and farmed it, and essentially they killed their soil. They didn't listen to the teachings of God. Somewhere along the line, they heard him. Colossians 1:23 said, "Continue in the faith, firmly established and steadfast, not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven." There is at one point in time, everybody knew God's law or heard it and exposed to it. There's no excuse, but now we've got areas of the world that practice strange religions, following teachings like reincarnation. So now they don't even eat food that's available because that cow might be long-lost grandma. So there's people in this world who are starving while they've got steaks and burgers walking around the streets being worshipped. So there's lots of insanity going on out there because our ancestors didn't pay attention to God's law and instead decided to worship the creature and creation rather than the Creator. So records show, like going back to Ethiopia, that some of the worst famines in those areas happened in times of record harvest. How is that possible? Well, it's because the governments in charge of that farmland took the crops and sold it and lined their own pockets instead of letting the people eat their own food. And so a lot of the blame for starving children can be laid at the feet of corrupt governments. So there's lots of things that happen through history that causes people to suffer later on. Okay, Casey, you might be saying, but what about cancer and disease? You know, I'd say it's safe to say that there's probably not a one of us in this room who has not been touched in some way or another by cancer, whether it's in our own lives or in the lives of our loved ones. It's a widespread problem. What about cancer and other diseases? How do we explain that? Well, again, going back to choices our ancestors made, there's a lot of things that our folks have done that they just didn't know at the time what it was going to do. You know, for example, asbestos is a really cool product. Did you know that it's very, very flame retardant, and it's a very good insulation? When people were first working with asbestos, they would actually make complete suits out of asbestos and then roll around in a fire to show how flame retardant it was, because it was a really, really neat product. So we started using it everywhere. We put it in insulation around pipes. We used it in tiles. We used it in ceilings. So now you could build structures that were very, very flame resistant. Well, then we started discovering that those fibers that asbestos is made of, if they got into your lungs, it got there permanently and it caused lung cancer. So now we've wiped our hands clean of asbestos, and you know that if you got to remove it, it's a big, big process and a big deal. We just didn't know any better. And then, of course, there's all kinds of chemicals that we've made through the years, like DDT, that has some good benefits, but it's terrible for the body. You know, military things like Agent Orange and other chemical warfare that just completely mutated the gene pool. I'd say that probably a big majority of human beings have mutated genes because of things that we have done to ourselves. Then you throw in things like nuclear accidents. You know, we're all familiar with the Chernobyl accident in Russia back in 1986 and how terrible that was because people made some poor choices. They didn't put in the safety procedures like they were supposed to, and they didn't train their people well enough, and so it just snowballed to where that we can still measure radiation out here in our air today because of that accident. And did you know that since 1945 that there have been over 2,000 nuclear bombs exploded on this planet by various nations because we've been testing them? Every one of those that have gone off has left radiation in our atmosphere. We have done so much to ourselves, and some of it unknowingly, when we were just experimenting and testing. You know, there's so many radio waves bouncing through this room right now. There's just so much stuff going on that we don't know what it's doing to our bodies. Choices our ancestors made affect us to this day. That's why we have cancers and all these different things, because of things that we have done. Okay, Casey, well, what about, you know, the hurricane and that Joplin tornado and all those other natural disasters? How do you explain that? Well, let's talk about that. Right after the Joplin tornado, then President Obama uttered these words. He came to Joplin about a week after the tornado, and he said this: "The question that weighs on us at a time like this is why? Why our town? Why our home? When my son or husband or wife or sister or friend? Why? We do not have the capacity to answer," he says. "We can't know when a terrible storm will strike or where, or the severity of the devastation it may cause. We can't know why we're tested with the loss of a loved one or the loss of a home we've lived a lifetime. We can't know why tragedy strikes in the first place." Well, is that true? Is it a fact that we can't know why tragedies like these occur? Where is God during natural disasters? Well, here's the point I want to make. Genesis 1:31. It says, God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. That creation account he talks about at the end of every day, it was good, it was good, it was good. When he was done, it said it was very good. And my understanding of the Hebrew language is supposed to mean that God was saying it was perfect. And so I believe that God created a perfect planet Earth for human inhabitation. And it doesn't look anything like the earth we live on today. The earth that God made was perfectly made for humans to inhabit. You ever wonder why people in the first few chapters of the Bible lived to be almost 1,000 years old? Could it be that they were living in a place that was made perfect for human inhabitation? He created a world where there was no mutated genes yet. There were no cancers. There was no disease. He made it perfect for humans to inhabit. And then what happened? Well, we see in Genesis chapter 3 the record of entrance of sin into the world and the breaking of the covenant of God and the throwing of our ancestors out of the garden. None of the problems we have today were present in the Garden of Eden. Did you know that there have been expeditions to the North and South Poles, and scientists have found evidence of tropical vegetation in the poles? And we look at them today and they're just frozen wastelands. Like, how is that even possible? Well, it could be that the earth was so different back then that it could have been like an entire tropical paradise. And so some of us, people will say, why do we have these natural disasters today? Why are there earthquakes and floods and volcanoes and all this stuff? And they'll say, well, that's just the way God made it. Well, I submit to you that that's not the case. I say that is not the way God made it, and that's not the way it intended to be. Because of Adam and Eve's decision to disobey God and to eat of that fruit of the tree of good and knowledge and evil, they ate of that when God told them not to. They got thrown out of that garden, and then God cursed the land and put basically a curse on man. Said, you're going to have to work and toil and subdue the land. And we can read about that, how it got even worse and worse in Genesis chapter 6. In Genesis chapter 6 through 8, we can read the introduction and the cause of all the natural disasters we have today. Genesis chapter 6, beginning in verse 5, it says, the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. The Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. The following chapters, we read about that great flood that literally destroyed planet Earth. Peter talks about that. 2 Peter chapter 3, he's talking about people who says nothing's ever changed. Things continue on as they always have been. There's nothing new. But Peter says it escapes their notice in 2 Peter 3, verse 6, through the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. Peter is saying these people forgot that things have not always been the same, that God destroyed the world with water. And I submit to you this morning that the planet Earth that we're living on, as beautiful as it is the result of ultimate destruction. Now that flood we read about isn't just some great story. It's not just some fairy tale, just some good moral that we teach our children. That's a real recorded event and explains so much of why the earth looks the way that it does today. It's not unreasonable to suggest that the global flood of Genesis 6 through 8 not only radically altered the face of the earth, but simultaneously produced circumstances that are responsible for many natural disasters experienced since that time. New, higher mountains and lower valleys were produced by God after the flood. Here's an interesting passage in Psalm 104, beginning in verse 5. Psalm 104, verse 5. It says, He established the earth upon its foundations, so that it will not totter forever and ever. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. I'm thinking that this is a reference to that flood. And at verse 7 it says, At your rebuke they fled. That's the waters. And the sound of your thunder, they hurried away. And the mountains rose, and the valleys sank down to the place which you established them. You know, people who are often questioning the flood, they're like, well, where did all that water go? It's still here. But if you had a planet that was maybe not quite as mountainous and with many valleys as it is now, you could have had a big global flood that would cover the entire planet. And you push all the mountains up and you have all these valleys go down, well, then that water's got some place to go. I think there in Psalm 104, we're reading the after effects of the great flood. Well, what happens when you alter the shape of the earth and you push mountains up and bring valleys down? And maybe before the flood, you had kind of a protective barrier around the planet. You know, where in the King James it talks about the firmament, it talks about the waters above. We often wonder, like, what's that exactly referring to? Maybe it's referring to some kind of extra layer that's not there anymore. But anyway, you get rid of that protective layer and you alter the shape of the earth. Well, isn't that going to maybe affect the way our weather and climate is? So now you have the storms being produced from winds blowing over those mountains and wild temperature changes between the poles and the equator. It's not that hard to imagine why we would have all these storms and natural disasters and things after the planet's been altered dramatically. The entire planet was reshaped, causing all sorts of weather patterns to change, allowing strong and violent storms to form like never before. And again, this also goes back to help explain why we have more diseases and cancers today. You know, we're well aware of like the ozone layer and other things in our atmosphere that's supposed to protect us from harmful UV rays and radiation from the sun. So, you know, isn't it odd that our lifespans have been shortened by almost 90% from what we read in the first few chapters of Genesis? Perhaps back then, you know, there was no skin cancer or anything to worry about because it was a perfect place for humans to live. But after the flood, we see the lifespans just drop off dramatically. You know, now 100 years, that's a pretty long life. Back then, 900 years was kind of average. So there's lots of things that if you put all these pieces of the puzzle together, it starts to add up and make sense. Why do tornadoes and other natural disasters occur? Because of the choices our ancestors long, long ago in the Garden of Eden made. Now, we like to blame Adam and Eve sometimes, like it's all their fault. You know, if they hadn't done what they did, you know, we'd still be living in a perfect paradise. We got to remember, what did Paul tell us in Romans 3:23? All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We can't harp on Adam and Eve too much because we're not any different. We're not any different. We make bad choices too. So why is there so much evil, pain, and suffering in this world? Because of the choices we make, because of the choices others have made, and it's because of choices people made a long, long time ago. But one more thing I want to leave you with. Enduring evil, pain, and suffering is what makes us who we are. It's not fun, it's not enjoyable, but it's beneficial. Where there is only sunshine, there's only desert. Into everyone's lives, a little rain must fall. Again, we read 1 Peter 4:15, but let's read a little bit more of that. Peter says, let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters. Yet if any suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf. You know, sometimes that suffering is good for us. You know, James tells us that. James chapter 1, verses 2 and following. He says, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. You know, how we react to adversity is what defines our character. Bravery, valor, honesty, integrity, all these things are made stronger in face of suffering. And also, it helps us to look forward to heaven. You know, if life was just rosy and peachy all the time down here, do you think that we'd be thinking about another home? And I think if we're not careful, we can just get a little bit too comfortable in this wonderful world that we live in. Even the world that's a result of destruction and chaos. It's a beautiful world. And God's given us so many blessings. If we get a little too comfortable here, we can keep our eyes off the target. We miss the big picture. Suffering helps us to remember that there's a place that awaits us where there's no more pain, no more tears, and no more sorrow. The cause of all that is wrong with this earth is not godliness, but rather ungodliness. We must not blame God for all the wrong in this world. Sometimes I think that, excuse me, that we almost want to blame God. We shake our fists at him and say, why is this happening? Why did you allow this to happen? You know, if they're atheists, you say, there can't be a God. Well, I think a lot of them are just angry at God. Why is this going on? And so we've got to stop and remind ourselves it's not God's fault. It's not the result of godliness, but rather ungodliness because of poor choices that as humankind, as a totality, we have made. God didn't create us as robots to serve him slavishly without any kind of free moral agency. But we now reap the consequences of the misuse of freedom of choice and the choices that we have made, the choices that others have made, the choices that others have made a long time ago. We also need to remember that Satan is walking the earth wreaking havoc in our lives. 1 Peter 5:8, Peter warns us, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. He's always looking to attack. And there's nothing he wants to do more than to bring Christians down. So if he can inflict some suffering in our lives and make us start to question, why is God letting this happen? Is he really there? Does he really care? Is he really loving me? Does he not know what's going on? Is he unable to stop it? So if he can inflict enough pain in our lives to where we start asking those questions, questioning our faith, then he's winning the fight. I can see that being true in my own personal life. You know, I'm so grateful that Jonah was baptized into Christ almost 2 weeks ago. But you know, that very same day, Satan swooped in and just tried to pull the rug out from under Amanda and I for various reasons. And, you know, she's not here this morning because she's still struggling. But through it all, we still see the goodness of God shining through. We can still sing that all our lives, he has been faithful. Even though evil, pain, and suffering exist in this world and in our lives, his mercy, his grace, and the gift of his Son, we can have a hope of a better eternal home. You know, sometimes people ask, where is God when this is happening? Where was God when my son was taken from me? Where was God whenever this tragedy happened in my life? Well, probably in the same place he was when his son was killed. Let's not forget that he gave his only begotten son, and he had to witness that. People crucifying him in the most cruel way. The most innocent man on the planet crucified in the most terrible way. What about you this morning? Have you allowed the goodness of God to be present in your life? Ephesians 1 verse 3 tells us that only in Christ can these spiritual blessings be found. If you're not in Christ, then you don't have those blessings. So you can put on Christ this morning on baptism by confessing your belief before men and being baptized and buried in that watery grave and then living a life that's faithful to him. You can allow God's goodness to be present in your life this morning. If you need to respond to the invitation of Christ, why don't you come forward as together we stand and sing the song.